Morning, everyone. Welcome back to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church here in San Antonio, Texas. Welcome to this fourth class in the Ways of Prayer, our Lenten prayer class, discussing different types of prayer. This week and next week we'll be talking about contemplative prayer. Beginning this week we'll be talking about the use of the Jesus Prayer by talking about this book, An Altar in Your Heart, by the Bishop Bob Hibbs. But before we get to that, let me do a little bit of housekeeping stuff here. So we will, while we're discussing the book, if you've read the book and you want to comment on online, I'll be watching the comments and we can respond to them. So please, if you are watching live and you have read the book, please definitely comment so we can try and do as much of a discussion as possible. Discussions are a little difficult over the internet, but we'll do what we can. So before we get to that, I'd like to go ahead and begin just talking in general about contemplative prayer. So in the first book of Kings, chapter 19, we read about the prophet Elijah on Mount Horeb. And the Bible says, "And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice." In our modern lives, we're all very busy most of the time, and even when we're not, there is a whole lot of distractions. And almost all of us suffer from that most pervasive of modern maladies, which I'm reliably informed that our younger brethren call FOMO, or the fear of missing out. Of missing out on that latest TV episode on NBC or CBS, or the latest thing to hit Netflix or Hulu, or the latest New York Times best-selling novel or movie in the movie theater. Of missing out on what people we follow on Twitter or Instagram have posted, or what our friends have said on Facebook. Or maybe even just missing out on that latest twist in the big news story of the day, whether that's a presidential election or a pandemic virus. We have to see that last thing that happened. We have to know the very latest development, which states have gone into lockdown, how many people have died, so on and so forth. Is it any wonder that in all of these distractions, that hearing that still small voice of the Lord is not easy? Contemplative or meditative prayer, if you'd rather, is about hearing that voice. It's about stopping, slowing down, putting all of the distractions aside, being present in and with ourselves and with God. And this is not always easy. I won't lie to you. For me personally, this is the most difficult of the different forms of prayer that we talk about in this class. Everyone is different. For some, this will be easier than for others. Now, there are many forms of contemplative prayer. If any of you have watched Father David's meditative prayers that have been live streamed on Tuesday nights, that's a fairly straightforward form of sitting still, being quiet and present. If any of you remember from a couple years ago when Father David, during the Lent season, did a Taizé service. Now, similar to the Taizé service, the two methods of contemplative prayer that we're going to talk about in this class are both based on using highly repetitive prayers to bring our minds and hearts to one focus, which is God, to rid ourselves of distractions and turn our being towards the source in an effort to hear that still small voice. Now, in today's class, we're talking about the Jesus Prayer. If you don't remember what that is, I'll pray it for you now. It's, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Very short, very easy to remember, very old. It is one of the oldest prayers. It's an ancient prayer of the church. It has been particularly popular through many different branches of the church, especially the Orthodox branches. And in fact, they've basically been practicing it for, 1500 years. That's what most of those Orthodox monks pray all the time. It's a very short prayer, but it says a lot of things, and that's why we're going to talk about, and to try and have the medium. That's why in a moment we're going to talk about it through the medium of this book by Bishop Hibbs about the prayer. Hopefully you've all read it by now. It's often prayed with prayer beads. It is very popular with people praying rosaries. In fact, when we discuss the Anglican rosary next week, you'll find that there are several sets of prayer that include the Jesus prayer. The idea is essentially to pray a lot of short, repetitive prayers to guide your mind and spirit towards God, the focus of God. My general advice at the end is that once you've done that for a set period of time, like maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes, to then just sit still and quiet, focusing on God. But now we're going to start the discussion section here. So I have a guest here from our class, Kristen. And Chris Pagonis has also read the book, and he promises to pipe up at least once from over there. So, Kristen, is there anything in the book that particularly struck you that you want to?
I think probably 3 main takeaways. The first is, I'm sure we'll talk about this more soon, is the breakdown of the prayer itself, kind of word by word, going through that. Another one is how he says not to look at spiritual practice as sort of a buffet that you can choose like once every day of the week, but instead to really like commit to something for like, I think he said 90-day period, which I think is good to really understand and figure out if something is right for you, because he says like this prayer might not be the best thing to connect with God for everyone, but as long as you try it, at least you give it a shot. And then finally, the progression. So going from something that's purely verbal to like a breathing prayer, like internal, and finally something that's a part of you, which I didn't quite understand that one, but I'm sure we'll also talk more about that too.
Yes. Part of you, I mean, I can tell you my experience is part of it being not necessarily this prayer and one other prayer, the one you hear in the morning and evening prayer always pops up in my mind periodically, which is what they call the Gloria Patri, the glory to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Mm-hmm. That and the Jesus prayer, I mean, I don't know if it's part of me in the same way he's talking about. As he said, the experience is kind of different with everyone. I think he says somewhere that, what the prayer means to him may not be what it means to you. The way he uses it may not be the way you use it. But I guess the way I've seen it, both of these, is that periodically I'll just be doing something, and for some reason, one of them just kind of it's like the first word pops into my head, and once it's there, I usually am going to finish it. So I suddenly glory to the glory to the Father, the Son, or Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. So that's one way. I think he talks about how
something like it's going along with your heartbeat.
Yes.
According to the rhythm of your heartbeat.
Yes, and because it's very internal, to some extent. I read a couple books on this when I was researching for this class, and they had this very interesting thing about how the Greek Orthodox, when they teach it, they tell you to try that you start praying it in your head, and then you pray it in your heart, and then they say that there's a deeper part that kind of corresponds to your stomach, but what they mean by that is that it's like you're the absolute core of your being, that it's like down in there somewhere.
Maybe like you're putting your all into it, sort of thing.
Right. And we've had, I know that one of the things, and this kind of goes along with my idea of using it in contemplative prayer, using it to kind of bring your focus to God, is one of the things I'd read suggested that the prayer acts as a sort of a way to tune the radio of the heart to God's voice.
That's a good metaphor, actually. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah. So let me see here. I had one or two things I had marked that I thought might be interesting to discuss. Right. So one of the things I've found now, he kind of half touches on this, but not exactly in the book, but is the bit about the have mercy. Mm-hmm. And I've read that a lot of people who don't like the prayer, this is the part they have trouble with. Mm-hmm. Is they don't like the have mercy for whatever reason. It sounds, I think I read somewhere someone said it sounds like a prisoner pleading in a court with a judge.
Right.
They don't like that. How do you feel about it?
Well, he mentioned about the word sinner, how it makes people feel like they're a worm or mm-hmm. like less than human in sort of way. And then he explained like the human psyche. Sometimes we feel on top of the world, that we're entirely self-sufficient, everything in our life is going right. But then something comes along and kind of rocks our boat, and then we feel the complete opposite, like we're not even human, we're less than human for some sort of mistake we did. And I think I've kind of seen that in my life during times of like great change, and in other people's lives as well. So he chooses to reinterpret the word sinner in that part of the Good Friday portion of the prayer as saying that we're still human, but we're struggling in some areas, and we need help to overcome our struggles. And that's where Jesus comes in. That's where God comes in. So being a sinner doesn't mean less than human. It just means a human with struggles.
Yes. And that's a good example of, again, one of those other ones that I read while researching for this, is they point out that maybe the best way to think of it is not in the context of a prisoner pleading in court, but instead we all remember the parable Jesus told of the Good Samaritan, and he's going along the road, and some robbers come up and they beat him up and they rob him and they leave him on the side of the road, so helpless that he can't even ask for help. And the scribe and the priest walk on the other side of the road, but the Samaritan comes along and he helps the man up and saves him from death. And so the person said that this is the context we should think of mercy in, is not necessarily pleading for forgiveness, but perhaps we're acknowledging that we are helpless without God, and that God is there to help, and that sometimes that's the only thing that can pick us up. That's kind of like what he was talking about with the kind of the connection to the Alcoholics Anonymous program. With that idea, I believe one of the steps there is acknowledging that there's a higher power, and only with the help of that higher power can you overcome. Is that?
I like that. It deals a lot with how you interpret the words. Maybe like some of your history growing up has made you think of words in a certain different context. So it's either up to you to like change that context in your mind, or maybe just find another prayer that's better for your connection.
Right.
That's the way I'm viewing it. And I think I can go ahead and reinterpret that context to take it out of the courtroom and to think of it more as compassion.
Excellent. And so you said you kind of like that idea of what he was saying about 90 days or whatever. What do you think about his thing about setting aside a specific, like, oh, let's do this for 5 minutes or whatever?
I like that, especially for Lent. Maybe I would do it for like the rest of Lent, or if I was outside of Lent, maybe I would shorten that to a month instead of 90 days for just me personally. But I think it's good definitely to step aside a huge chunk of time, or maybe a few days, to just concentrate on a new practice that you're interested in.
Yeah. And then, what he was saying about setting aside like 5 or 10 minutes, like let's just pray. So that's you're basically repeating it over and over again, which is very similar to the way a rosary works. In fact, when we talk about rosaries next week, the whole point of a rosary or prayer beads is that ultimately they're just a tool to help you keep track of what you're doing to some extent.
I feel like we should talk about that a bit more, because I've heard protest of people saying we shouldn't use anything like the rosary or to repeat prayers, since inside the Bible there's a verse about not repeating the prayers and doing as like the pagans do, because they think it'll give the prayer more power. Oh, we're not, in this context, we're not thinking of it as giving it more power, we're thinking of it as just helping us to concentrate on God. So it's for our benefit and not for God to give us more power through the repetition, it's to help us concentrate on something.
God hears you the first time.
Right.
What do you think, Chris?
It's a tool to focus on God. Prayer or meditation, just another tool in the toolbox to focus our minds and hearts to God.
That's right. So we... yes, there's, especially in the more evangelical bent, they'll definitely have problems with a lot of the little tools, even things like, using this gong down here during church services and stuff like that would seem a little questionable. This gong here.
I like it. It sounds nice. I guess that's all for everyone, too.
But they're just tools that something similar I've seen is some people have what's called I think it's called a holding cross. Have you ever seen one of these?
I have not.
It's usually a little cross about so big. It's designed to just kind of hold in your hand while you're praying. And so a lot of people, again, it's just a tool to help you focus as opposed to anything else. I know that in the Orthodox Church, which is kind of the rosary. When we'll talk more about that next week, really. But the rosaries ultimately kind of go back to a very ancient practice. The Orthodox Church has something similar, which is prayer beads, but they don't usually have the different sizes of beads. It's just like one prayer over and over and over again.
I think he referred to it as a prayer rope. Is that the same thing?
A prayer rope is generally going to be the same thing, except usually that's going to use knots instead of beads. But
okay,
yeah. Let's see here. Let me find one of the other things I thought. Was interesting to talk about. Chris, you want to say anything about the book?
I was going to jump in real fast, talking about setting aside time to pray. So I was originally introduced to this book when I was in Corcio eons ago. And of course, well, the people probably watching don't know, but since I can't drive, I usually take the bus everywhere. And I used that time on the bus to do my praying, because what else am I going to do sitting on the bus? And then in doing so, that almost cemented it as a practice, I may not always do the Jesus prayer. Actually, one of my favorites is, what's her name? I can see her in front of me. Julian Norwich's, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
Right.
Kind of my life mantra. But same thing, same idea applies.
Exactly. And Chris, just as a side note here, for some reason my internet keeps dropping out. So if you see any comments on Facebook or YouTube, I don't know if we will get any, but if so, please chime in and let me know, because that's just not really working right now. But I have no problem with the internet until right now when I'm trying to use it during a live stream.
we could talk a bit more about the breakdown, how he set aside the first half to be sort of the Easter part of the prayer.
Easter.
And I like the terminology he used here, like the Easter part of the prayer, the joyful part, and then the Good Friday part, and how it's always both at the same time.
It's kind of like how we said in the first class about the different uses of prayer. You've got your praise, your alleluia type thing, which we're not supposed to say during Lent, but I'm just saying it in this context. I'm not really saying it. But your praise type of thing, and your thanksgivings, and your, have mercy on me, a sinner type, your
Penitence.
penitential, your intercessory type stuff where you're asking God to help you with something. And so this prayer, like he says, this prayer basically gets two halves in there. The first half, you really get that praise bit, and then the second half, you get the penitential, intercessory, have mercy on me, help me. And that is, the prayer has a number of different forms, which I think he mentioned. Some people leave off a sinner bit, and some people prefer, because they don't really like the word mercy, so they'll change that to help me or something like that, because it just works better in their mind. Do you have any problem with the way it's written here? The Lord Jesus Christ.
Not for me in particular, just because, like I said, I feel like it can change the context in my mind to reinterpret the words to mean something else that's both beneficial in that relationship. But I can understand others who maybe have like a background that makes it more difficult for them, like they were raised to think of the relationship with God in a different way. It might be more difficult.
Sure.
But for me, I don't have that much of a problem with it. But I like just the idea that you can be both like in penitence and be joyful at the same time, sort of all the time.
It's a good thing. And, we can talk about it. You were mentioning how he was talking about how it kind of like becomes internal and stuff. And I was thinking about that parallel with what we talked about with the traditional liturgical prayer using the Book of Common Prayer. The idea of repeating the prayer is that it over time becomes written in your mind and eventually in your heart, and that you take it internally. So that those people who have a problem with repeating prayers, like you were saying, the point is we're repeating the prayers not for God's benefit necessarily, but for our benefit, to help us focus more and to help God, help us change our lives to focus more on God.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that was an interesting parallel about how, in the same way that this, and like I said, and the other things I read about this Jesus prayer, they said very similar things, that it like starts here and kind of moves down. And
it becomes like it seems an anchor of sorts in your life, something to hold on to when crazy stuff out in the world is happening, like right now.
Yes.
So I feel like if there was ever a time to try a practice like this, it'd probably be around now. But if we also want to talk about the progression, he really laid it out in certain portions of the chapter. He went from it being more of like a purely verbal and like very physical sort of thing to something that's just breathing. Like when you breathe in, you do the first part, and then when you breathe out, you do the second part. And then it becomes like an inward thought sort of thing, and then it becomes like part of you. So he says the last part is more of a gift from God. It's not something you can really practice on your own.
Right, and I would point that out. That very much goes in line with the other books on the Jesus prayer I read. Is that if your goal is to internalize it, understand that it's probably not going to work because you can't really force it. That bit where it's just pervading your being, as he kind of describes, or it's always there. But apparently, as he says, you shouldn't do it while driving. I think that's what he said.
Oh, yeah.
He starts drifting off the...
Drifting. Concentrate on God instead of the road.
Yeah.
Tell you to do it on the bus, you'll be fine.
Yeah, on the bus, when someone else is driving, unless you're the bus driver.
Instead of like
not.
Picking up your Facebook or Instagram or everything. Pick up the Word of God.
Yes. And, that's kind of like both with these short prayers, with contemplative prayer. We talk about what works for people. You can very much do it on the bus and in public. There's nothing against that. I've always personally found that the two ways I've found contemplative prayer to work best for me personally are kind of a very traditional dark room, lighted candle type thing. And then the other way is actually outside in nature. When I went to the Diocesan Council recently, we had a workshop or class or group or something about finding God in nature, and a big chunk of it was just, okay, you've all got 15 minutes. I want you all to go out and just... And so I went and sat in the grass and, kind of did contemplative prayer and focused on a small yellow flower I found, and it very much, had the sense of peace and stuff come over me that, the point is, he talks about how God is everywhere. God is in all of us and all around us and is in everything, even the chair we're sitting on and the table in front of us and the microphone, and crazy people on the internet and crazy people everywhere. That everywhere, God is everywhere. And I think part of contemplative prayer is, while God is everywhere, it's not always easy for us to perceive him. Mm-hmm. And now that's not because God is trying to hide from us, not at all. He wants us to know him, but our own human nature kind of gets in the way sometimes, and contemplative prayer is kind of, to some extent, about fighting that human nature. It's not real. I mean, I don't know, maybe you'll have different experience, but I found it is not in my nature to sit down, be quiet, and banish all thoughts from my head. It doesn't work very easily. That's why, for me, this type of prayer, contemplative prayer, is very much the absolute hardest type of the three different types we talk about in the class. I've had success using both Jesus prayer and using the rosary, but in both cases, if I'm being honest, I've had more cases where, I don't know whether you want to call it unsuccessful, but it's like, I just couldn't, I did the repetitive bit, but I just really failed at the end and couldn't manage to just sit still without thoughts or being present. And it's a hard thing, and I think sometimes maybe you need to kind of build up to it. So what I'd suggest to anyone in the class who hasn't tried it is, do the Jesus prayer for 5 minutes, or when we talk about the rosary next week, do that for, do a set of rosary prayers, and then afterwards just, maybe start small. Just try and sit quietly, banishing thoughts from your head for like 3 or 4 minutes. Don't just automatically say, I'm going to sit here for an hour without, you're probably going to fail rather spectacularly if you try that. Because the first thing is you'll have a thought, and then you'll think about banishing the thought, and then you're just down on a whole thing at that point.
Speaking of the rosary, there's like different sizes of beads on there. Yeah. Are all of them the Jesus prayers, or do you kind of mix it with other prayers?
It mixes with other prayers. The rosary, which, like I said, we'll talk about more next week, and Chris has even brought in a very special camera to help us kind of demonstrate on the rosary. You get sets of prayers, so there's like, for usually the Jesus prayer, in all the sets I've seen the Jesus prayer used in, is used on the smaller beads, which are the ones that there are more of. Mm-hmm. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, I've seen one of the things where I was reading about the Jesus prayer, the person would talk about, committing to doing the Jesus prayer a certain number of times in a row, instead of like, so Bishop Hibbs recommends a time period. So he says that just 5 minutes, almost don't worry about how many you're saying. Don't worry about counting. Some of the others that I've read, it's all about counting. That's part of why they use the ropes. It helps you keep track of how many you're doing. And in a rosary, it's the same thing. So if you are using the Jesus prayer in a rosary and you pray the whole thing, let's see. So that's 7, 4, that's 28, right? 28 times 3, so 84, 80, 56, 20, 76, 80. It's about 80 times, something like that. Somewhere around 80 times if you do a whole rosary the way it's meant to be done. Because like I said, this is always usually on the small ones. One of the things you can do, like I said, I've talked about going out in nature. Have you ever gone somewhere specific, either here at the church or a similar type place to pray?
I usually just do it inside my apartment.
Yeah.
I have like a few different objects
Mhm.
that helps me concentrate or get in a state of mind that's helpful. So for me that's helpful. But usually I just don't go outdoors.
Yeah.
Where would you suggest though, like besides the church, of course?
I mean, anywhere, park or something. I mean, churches are always very nice, but, just sitting in a park, just remember, you're allowed to go to the park at the moment, just keep your distance from anyone else who might also be in the park. Or walking, I've found, I believe he talks in here about doing it while he jogs or something like that. So I've done it while I was walking. I don't know if you've ever seen this Leon Creek Greenway down here. It's very nice and nice walk in nature, and frankly, every time I've been down there have been very few people. So, and there's places along the way where you can just kind of sit and contemplate and pray, and but yeah, just get outside. I think nature is kind of a resource of connecting with God that a lot of us have forgotten about.
Right.
It's kind of harder when you live in an apartment, but for those of you who live in a house, go out in your backyard. Sit on the back porch, listen to the birds, and let's see. I'm trying to remember one of the other things. Just remember, everybody, I apologize for any pauses in here. It's just that running a book discussion over the internet with just one or two people here in person is a little harder than when we have a whole classroom full of people to pipe up and pipe in. Chris, you have any more thoughts?
I was going to jump in talking about how the section where he's like making the prayer yours.
Yeah.
And how people add or subtract words or whatnot.
Right.
I've always been a big fan of N.T. Wright's version,
Mm-hmm.
even though I almost always disagree with his theology. That's another discussion altogether. His is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And I was like, I just kind of like that.
Sure.
It
Yeah,
resonates.
it's a nice.
Right. Yeah.
I would say this is like a base prayer, and you can change it. Like I said, some people change it and replace mercy with help if, for whatever reason. Because the idea of all prayer, including this prayer, is to connect with God. And so if there's something in the prayer that's just, if mercy for whatever reason is a stumbling block for you, and it is more helpful for you to say help instead of have mercy, by all means, but I think the structure of the prayer is very good, keeping with that kind of combination of either praise and penitence, or praise and intercession, if you'd rather call it that, where you're asking for help. Do you have any more?
Off the top of my head, not right now.
It's all right.
No, it's okay. I think I've pretty much hit on all of my three main takeaways.
Okay. Well, I think we're probably going to wrap up. I want to thank Kristen and Chris and
thank you, Stephen.
everyone watching. And again, for those of you who have taken the class who really would like to discuss it, I will probably teach the class again later in the year in person, just because I know not everyone is able to watch it on the internet and so forth. And those of you in the class who may be wondering what to do with these books are a gift. You are welcome to keep them. So please enjoy them and meditate on the Jesus Prayer. And just a couple things before we go. I'll be back this evening praying evening prayer right 2 at 7:30. Father David up tomorrow with morning prayer at 9 a.m. Other than that, wash your hands, limit your going out, cover your coughs, and have a great day.